David James Poissant is the author of the story collection, The Heaven of Animals, winner of the GLCA New Writers Award and a Florida Book Award, longlisted for the for the Penn Award and the Robert Bingham Prize, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He teaches the MFA program at the University of Central Florida and lives in Orlando with his wife and daughters. His debut novel, Lake Life, was published with Simon & Schuster this past July. He's going to be doing a craft talk of about a half an hour here with us, and then he's going to be answering some questions. So let me give you David James Poissant.
Hello, thank you. Thanks, Adam. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you, Charlotte, for also facilitating this. Thank you to Isabella for the emails, and thank you for the Stokes Center for having me and for allowing me to do this. This is really exciting. I've given, like a lot of writers with a book launched in the time of COVID, I've done a number of Zoom readings, but I haven't gotten to give a lot of lectures or give craft talks. And I've been teaching all online, which is just not as fun for someone who actually loves teaching. So I can honestly say that this was a really fun opportunity for me when they asked me to do a craft talk on novels and novel beginnings. I embraced it, and I had a lot of fun this week thinking about, what is a novel? What tips would I give for writers beginning to write novels? So I came up with this talk. It went a little long, so I'm going to condense it, and I'm going to go as fast as I can. I will make the promise now that if I'm going too fast, don't worry if you can't keep up with the notes. I will send a PDF of these thoughts and my bulleted lists to Dr. Pence and Dr. Prince, and I will make sure they can disseminate those if you want that. So this is not, like private stuff. You can make this public. But yeah, so I think we'll just get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and if I am doing this correctly, you should now see a PDF up there. Okay, good. It looks like that's working. Yeah, so the title of this talk is Buying the Flowers Yourself, which takes its name from the opening line of Mrs. Dalloway, which is one of my favorite novels of all times. And when I talk to students about writing novels, when I think about writing a novel, I like to tell them that I'm descended from a long line of blue-collar workers. My dad was a roofer, and he was a short order cook before he was in sales. And so I'm most comfortable talking about fiction as kind of a trade. And I believe, like with any trade, there are a lot of tips and tricks and hacks and shortcuts. So rather than speaking about the novel abstractly, speaking about it as something that's, inspired by the muse, I want to talk about it just very nuts and bolts, very craft forward, by talking about how you can begin a novel, what to look for in the beginning of a good novel, the first chapter or first section of a novel, as well as things to think about when you're building the novel, and then things to think about when you're revising a novel. Now, of course, it goes without saying that everything I say tonight will not apply to all novels. And as soon as I say something, I can think in the back of my head of 5 novels that do the opposite. But I would say that if you're not trying to get super fancy with it and you just want a really good primer on the basics of a first novel, what I'm going to say probably applies to 85 to 90% of most debut novels being published today. So here we go. All right. A first chapter. First chapters make or break a book. A reader picks up the book. They want to read the book or they don't. And a first chapter can and probably should do 10 things. We're going to look at 3, maybe 2 novel first chapters and how they do or don't do these things. So the first thing you want to do immediately, as soon as possible, is identify the protagonist of your novel as quickly as possible. Sometimes the protagonist is the viewpoint character. Sometimes the protagonist is not the viewpoint character. Sometimes there's an omniscient narrator. Whatever the case, you want to set up that narrative quickly and let us know who are our main characters. You also want to establish a narrative voice, and you want it to be a very signature voice. So if you think about a novel like The Great Gatsby with a voice like Nick Carraway, he begins, in my younger and more vulnerable years, my father imparted some wisdom to me. And you realize that, okay, this is going to be this sort of verbose, wordy guy who's very nostalgic and likes to talk about himself and his childhood. And he proceeds to do that for much of the novel. And we love him for it. Number 3, give the opening scene a setting. All right, we don't want characters floating in space. We don't want talking heads going back and forth. We're not writing a screenplay, we're writing a novel. So for most novels, you want to make sure that you open in some sort of an announced setting. You also want to make sure that your viewpoint character right away has a motivation. This doesn't have to be the motivation for the entire novel. All right. You don't have to spill all the secrets right away, but you want to just give them something to do in every scene. Even if it's as simple as going to buy some flowers. Number 5, you want to provide a direction for the arc of the first chapter. So every chapter or scene in a book, much like a short story, although they don't have to stand alone the way a short story does, but every scene should have some sort of a narrative arc where, if the scene is dinner, then we recognize that the scene will probably be over when dinner is over. Now, of course, this isn't true of all scenes, but you want to have a general idea of what the arc is that you're giving us. Number 6, the first chapter should probably familiarize us with most of the characters. Maybe we don't meet them yet, but there should probably be a mention so that we're not surprised later on when someone becomes a main character. You don't want to wait too long to introduce your cast. 7, you want to introduce any thematic elements that are going to recur. And 8, you want to introduce any kind of images or patterns that are going to recur in a novel. Number 9, the first chapter is a great place to establish a tone or the mood of the book. Now, this doesn't mean it's going to be the same mood all the way through. A lot of great writers have multiple moods. George Saunders, for example, loves to get the reader laughing before he kind of pulls the rug out from under the reader and the story becomes tragic. Likewise, plenty of tragedies also have moments of levity. So, this doesn't have to be sustained the whole time, but we want to get a general sense of what is the mood of this book going to be like. And then finally, the first chapter is never too soon to begin foreshadowing things to come. We're looking eventually to work toward an ending in our novel that feels both surprising and inevitable. I think that's a Flannery O'Connor quote. She said that an ending should be both surprising and inevitable. And often the best endings are, which means that looking back from the ending, often a reader should be able to see that even in chapter 1, you were already dropping the breadcrumbs for how we were going to get to where we wound up. That sounds like a lot of things. And a lot of the time students ask me, how do you do 10 things in one chapter? And then my answer is to show them the opening of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, because I would argue that she does not all 10 of these, but many of these things, not just in the first chapter of her novel. She does it in the very first sentence of Mrs. Dalloway. So let's look at that first sentence. The opening line of Mrs. Dalloway is, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. All right, it's one of those deceptively simple opening lines, but I want you to think about all the things that line is doing. All right, if we look at our kind of checklist of 10 things, number 1, do we know who the protagonist is? Yes, now we know Mrs. Dalloway is going to be the protagonist of this novel. She will not be the only character. She will not be the only viewpoint character, but she's our main character. And we learn a lot just in a few words. We learn that she's Mrs. Dalloway, which is to say she's married. And that's important because her marriage and her interest in another man will become a pivotal part of this book. And so we know that marriage is now an important theme. She is on her way to do something herself, which means it's declaring a kind of independence. And this is going to be an early feminist text that is about the independence of women. And then what's really interesting is just that pronoun, herself. It tells us that she has money, because who is she talking to? And what does herself mean? It means that she is telling a servant, someone who she pays to take care of these things normally, like, no, I'll buy the flowers myself. And so suddenly we realize, like, oh, this is a woman of privilege. This is someone in a position with a lot of money who is doing something and choosing to do something that she could have someone else paid to do for her. All right. So all that is just unpacked in this one very short sentence. We have the establishment of our voice. We understand that we're in a third person. We understand that we're in a past tense. We have a direction, a motivation for the character. She's leaving home. She's heading to a flower shop. And we have a setting. The setting is the city that she's on her way to. We understand that she's going to buy flowers. We'll find out later that's for a party. So we get the sense that if this scene does have an arc, it's probably going to be when she gets to the flower shop and she buys the flowers. We have a direction. We know that this scene will be over when she either achieves or fails to achieve the buying of the flowers. We don't have all of our characters introduced immediately because this is a novel that uses what we call a roving limited omniscience, where we move into the heads of multiple characters, then we learn later that as we move into each character's head, we're going to get to meet new characters. But for now, she's our main character. We see the recurrence of themes. And then, I talked about recurrence of imagery. This novel is full of flower imagery, that the flowers populate the entire novel. They keep popping back up in different ways. So it's significant that the very first sentence contains the word flowers when we're going to see that as a kind of recurring image throughout the book. So I'm going to skip forward. We're going quickly. This is paragraph 4 of Mrs. Dalloway. She stiffened a little on the curb, waiting for Dirtnall's van to pass. A charming woman, Skirt Povis thought her. And then it goes on to describe Grope's description of her. That's the moment at which we realize, like, okay, this novel is teaching me this is not going to just be Mrs. Dalloway's point of view. This book is going to, as it wishes, zoom in and out of other characters' heads, even characters who won't be main characters, even just someone standing on a curb in the city seeing her is going to be able to describe her because she's not describing herself to us. So the novel is teaching us the rules of how to read it. And I think it's really important that within the first couple of chapters of a book, you make clear if you're going to be dipping in and out of points of view, you've got to do it right away, because you don't want to give us half a novel and then change points of view or change sort of verb tenses, and then suddenly we feel like we're reading a different book we weren't trained to read. Now, of course, as soon as I say this, I'm thinking of Jenny Offal's amazing novel, Department of Speculation, which does this beautifully, but she's Jenny Offal, so she's kind of earned the right to break that rule. All of which is to say, all these rules can be broken once you feel comfortable and know what you're doing. The next paragraph goes on to describe the city. In people's eyes, and the swing, tramp, and trudge, and the bellow and uproar, the carriage, the motor cars, the omnibuses, the vans. She's giving us the setting. She's showing us the city without telling us. She doesn't tell us, what year it is, exactly what day, but she tells us it's June and it's London, and that's what we need to know. We know because there's an airplane that it's contemporary London, that it's the time in which she lives. Several paragraphs later, too, I'm not going to take the time to read all this, but we have this beautiful description of flowers at the end of this section. She gets to the flower shop. She's describing all the flowers that she's seen. This is, again, number 3, more setting. It is, again, fulfilling the promise of character motivation, which was going to get the flowers, which is that number 4 we talked about. She's reached the destination of the opening arc of the scene, which was that number 5 we talked about. And then we're recurring to our recurring image of flowers, which is that number 8. Immediately, this description of flowers is interrupted by a car backfiring outside. And then we get the line, a pistol shot in the street outside. So this car backfire is mistaken for a pistol shot. And this moment ends the first chapter of Mrs. Dalloway. They're not numbered chapters, they're sections with section breaks. And then we move into the head of our next major viewpoint character, Septimus. And it's significant that the scene ends with what sounds like what is mistaken for a gunshot, because I don't want to, it seems weird to say spoiler alert on a novel that's almost 100 years old, but Septimus is going to meet an unfortunate end. And so it's not a coincidence that at this point in the novel, we are getting something that sounds like death. It's a foreshadowing, as promised, of something that's going to happen to Septimus. All right. So normally, I'm so used to teaching, this would be where I would ask, does anybody have any questions? So at this point, if you have questions, please just write them down. And at the end, there'll be a long Q&A, and I'm happy to stay as long as people want. And I'm happy to answer any questions or clarify things that might not make sense. I'm going to look at a second text here. This is from a much more recent novel. This is the novel By Nightfall by Michael Cunningham. Michael Cunningham won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel The Hours, which was a kind of contemporary retelling of Mrs. Dalloway. And he's one of my favorite writers. And this novel By Nightfall is a kind of, it's his book after Mrs. Dalloway. And there's a good question as to whether Peter, the narrator of By Nightfall, shares something in common with Peter from Mrs. Dalloway as well. But I love the opening line of By Nightfall. The opening line reads, "The mistake is coming to stay for a while," which is just a great hook that really hooks you in, makes you want to read more. At least it did for me. This is followed by the wife's first line of dialogue. Are you mad about Mizzy? Rebecca says. Of course not, Peter answers. I love that too, because that of course to me is a real tell. He could have said, no, I'm not mad. I'm really not. The fact that he has to say, of course not, you can detect that of course he is, right? And then if you keep reading on, you'll see that the conversation as it nears argument, you realize in the subtext of what Peter's saying that he really is mad that her little brother is coming to stay for a while, even though he says that he's not. Let me read the rest of this opening page of By Nightfall, and I'll do the same thing with this that I did with Mrs. Dalloway, which is I will talk about how he's fulfilling each of those kind of 10 principles of an opening chapter. One of the old, inscrutable horses that pull tourist carriages has been hit by a car somewhere up on Broadway, which has stopped traffic all the way down to the Port Authority, which is making Peter and Rebecca late. Maybe it's time to start calling him Ethan, Rebecca says. I'll bet nobody calls him Mizzy anymore but us. Mizzy is short for the mistake. Outside, the cab pigeons clatter up across the blinking blue of a Sony sign. An elderly, bearded man in a soiled, full-length down coat, grand in his way, stately, plump Buck Mulligan, pushes a grocery cart full of various somethings in various trash bags, going faster than any of the cars. Inside the cab, the air is full of drowsily potent air freshener, vaguely floral, but not really suggestive of anything beyond a chemical compound that must be called sweet. Did he tell you how long he wants to stay? Peter asks. I'm not sure. Her eyes go soft. Worrying overmuch about Mizzy, Ethan, is a habit she can't break. Peter doesn't pursue it. Who wants to go to a party in mid-argument? So if Mrs. Dalloway is a novel about preparing for a party, By Nightfall is a novel that begins with characters going to a party, which is, I don't think, a coincidence. But let's look at this checklist of what Michael Cunningham is doing here. So number one, do we have a viewpoint character? Yes. We're told it's Peter. We understand that, like Clarissa Dalloway in the Virginia Woolf novel, this guy spends a lot of time in his own head. We also know that he's clearly a reader. He's going to make a number of literary references throughout the book unapologetically. The stately pluck bump Mulligan is a reference to James Joyce's novel Ulysses, the opening line of that. So there's going to be a lot of sort of metafictional play with texts in this book. We get a narrative voice that's present tense and close third. We get our setting, much like Clarissa walking through London. Here we have Peter stuck in a cab trying to navigate the streets of New York City in contemporary times. We have this character motivation, which is to navigate a really tense conversation about his wife's brother coming to stay with them for a while. We have a destination, which is to get to the party. We have an obstacle to getting to that destination, which is unfortunately a dead horse in the road. Even though we haven't met Mizzy yet, we know that now the three main characters in this book will be Peter, Rebecca, and Mizzy or Ethan. We're introduced to all the thematic elements that will appear in this novel: death, family, and marital tensions. And we're introduced to images and sensory details that are going to keep popping up over the course of the book. Those include literary references as well as the city at night. The narrator is going to spend a lot of time. When I say narrator, I mean third person close narrator. He's going to spend a lot of time walking around the streets at night thinking, and that becomes something that will keep recurring. The tone or mood, I don't know what you would want to call it. I think of this as kind of claustrophobic. We're stuck in his head and we're stuck in a cab, and much of the book is like that, where we're stuck in this guy's head. And then we get this foreshadowing of something bad that is about to happen. The brother's nickname is literally the mistake. And so you understand that his coming here is going to be a mistake, and it is going to be the thing that potentially has the power to wreck their marriage. And then there's just sort of fun subtextual things going on here. Peter says he's not mad. We can tell he is. This to me is fun as just a reader. I love the line where he's looking at the man who pushes a grocery cart full of various somethings in various trash bags. Someone who's not reading with care might look at that and think like, oh, Michael Cunningham couldn't think of another word except for various twice. And I don't think that's the case. I think he's being playful. And I think his book is teaching us as Mrs. Dalloway taught us, that we could jump into anyone's head at any point. This book is teaching us at almost the same point in its first page that this is not a book where you can jump into anyone's head. We don't have the option to jump into that guy's head, and we don't know what the things are in those trash bags because we're only in Peter's head. This book is kind of announcing to us, like, you're stuck with Peter, enjoy the ride. Whatever anyone else in the city is doing, you don't get the privilege of jumping into their head the way you do in a Woolf novel. So that's just another way the novel's teaching us to read it. It's teaching us that this will be a book that has a lot of literary references. I knew that bothered some critics about this book. I think that's nonsense. I think it's fun. I think it's nice to have a sort of an unapologetic love of literature. It's not a book for everyone, but I don't think it should apologize for itself. And finally, what I want to mention is this book does a really excellent job of juggling a lot of balls, and that's no small thing. When you're trying in an opening chapter to present character interiority, which is the way a character thinks, dialogue, action, description, both inside the cab and out of the cab, sensory details, not just the way things look, but how they smell and feel, as well as the setting for the book, which in this case is New York City. It's hard to do all of that in one page, and this book does that quickly in this very staccato rhythm. If you notice, we never go more than 2 sentences without a paragraph break. So he's not slowing down and really looking at one thing the way that Mrs. Dalloway does at Flowers for just sentences and sentences. He's making sure that we're hearing the voices, we're in the characters' heads, we're seeing the world. We don't slow down. It's this very sort of almost almost film-like thing where you've kind of got this orchestral thing going on in the background, and your shots are just zooming around and cutting quickly from shot to shot. Okay, and we're gonna go one more here very quickly. I wouldn't normally do this. I never teach my own books ever, but I was told that since this is also kind of a Lake Life event, that I could share a bit from my novel. So I'm just going to read the first couple paragraphs here of Lake Life, which is the book that Dr. Prince mentioned, and talk about how I tried to do the same thing with my book. I don't believe that I'm writing at the same level as Cunningham or Woolf. I'm not going to pretend to, but I want to talk about why I made the choices I made and how I was trying to check off the things on that checklist as well. So here are the opening 5 paragraphs from Lake Life. The boy on the back of the boat laughing, the sky pewter stamped and threatening rain. Michael Starling, age 33, warm on his father's boat, watches the other boat, the boy, the bay, the water that will never be his because Michael's parents are selling the house. Yesterday they arrived, Michael and Diane, Jake and Thad, and were given the news Richard and Lisa Starling will not be retiring to the lake. And family summer home will be sold so that Michael and Thad's parents may retire instead to a pocket of Florida shore that screams margaritas and sand and all things distinctly unstarling. This decision is not like Michael's parents. They're not Florida people. They're ex-hippies, academics. They are lovers of cold mountain lakes and clear, cool streams, of trees that change color in the fall. Their summers are North Carolina summers, starry skies, and the converted double wide the family affectionately calls its cabin in the woods. So same thing here quickly. Checklist, viewpoint character, Michael. There are 6 viewpoint characters in the book, so the way that I taught the reader to read this book is that each of the first 6 chapters gives us a viewpoint of a different character. So we start with Michael, we move into Lisa, we move on to Diane, and you learn, okay, after 6 chapters, you've met the 6 characters through their point of view, and you realize these are the 6 points of view that are going to carry us through the novel. And even though they'll kind of pinball all over the place, each chapter will have its own speaker. We're introduced to a narrative voice, we're introduced to a setting, we're given a character motivation, which for Michael is to deal with this boy on the back of a boat and convince his parents not to sell their lake house. We have this direction for the first chapter, which in this case it breaks the rule a little. I've established this is what we call a slow reveal. Michael as a character is directionless in life. And so in this first chapter, he is directionless until the boy falls off the back of the boat. And that forces him, compels him into movement, into action. And the first chapter then has a direction. It introduces us to all of the characters, even though we don't meet them right away. We're laid out right there that we have this one couple, Michael and Diane. We have Michael's brother Thad and his partner Jake, and we have their parents, Richard and Lisa. So we know that those are going to be our 6 main characters. We're introduced to the thematic elements of boyhood, family, place, home, lake life, and children. Those will recur, as well as the images of sky, water, and stars, which flood the whole book. We also have this tone, which is this kind of ominousness. We see the rain clouds are gathering in. We know that nothing good is going to happen. And we see this nostalgia for how things used to be compared to how things are now. And then we finally have a foreshadowing. We're shown this boy on the back of a boat. And if you're guessing that's kind of the Chekhov's gun of the scene, you're right. Anton Chekhov had this expression that if you see a gun in a story, by the end of the story, it has to go off. In the case of chapter 1, this boy is just sitting on the back of a boat laughing, and we're waiting for him to fall off, and he does. The novel also kind of announces itself immediately that this is not going to be a beach read. Someone who picked it up for that reason might be a little surprised when they see that it's beginning with clouds and rain and darkness, and it's kind of my way of saying, like, okay, brace yourselves. This isn't going to be a super happy novel. And it also makes very clear that this is set in the South. This is not the lake life of a New England seaside mansion or a Great Lakes kind of lake. This is a double-wide trailer on a lake in North Carolina. And so it sets up reader expectation of what this book is going to be about and where it's taking place. All right, so that's a lot of things, but those are the things that you kind of have to juggle when you're beginning your novel and you want to see in a first chapter to help the reader know how to read it. Now, as you move forward, here are 10 quick suggestions for actually building the book. All right, this sounds simple, but it's harder than it sounds. 1, novels should have a beginning, middle, and end. That's it. I can't tell you how many novels have beginnings and middles, but not endings. I read a lot of them. And so I think the best novels are ones that don't always necessarily answer all your questions. Ambiguity can be okay, but I think that a novel often makes a promise in the first chapter, and I think you have to answer that promise. You have to find some sort of resolution to the major conflicts that you introduce in a book, whether it's a happy ending or a sad ending, whether the character gets what they want or doesn't, whether the character is happy that they got what they want or is ironically not happy they got exactly what they want. You should reach some sort of a conclusion in your novel most of the time. As we already said here, number 2, novels should present their premises quickly and hook the reader early. Number 3, novels should establish a pattern of readerly expectation in terms of point of view. Think about Mrs. Dalloway. Because we know we're going to be able to zoom in and out of other characters' heads with this roving limited omniscience, she does that right away. She does that in paragraph number 4, just to teach us that this is something she will do. Also, think about the shape of your novel. Now, there's no rule. I get the question a lot, how many chapters should a novel have? What's a good chapter length? And the fact is there's no good answer for that. In my novel, some of my chapters are 4 pages and some are 20 pages. The only thing that my novel teaches you is that the chapters can be any length. And then some of my favorite novels, like Marilyn Robinson's last few, they don't have chapters, period. You just have to stick a bookmark in somewhere and take a break because there's like no place to stop. And that's fine, as long as that's the consistent thing about the book. Now, that being said, there are novels that break those rules. Just know that if you, for example, have a novel that's built of very short chapters and then you suddenly give us one long chapter in the middle, I'm thinking here about The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, the long time passes section in the middle that every writer loves. That's fine. You can do that. Just know that that's really going to grab the reader's attention. It's kind of going to take over the memory of the reader. I also think about, the movie The Darjeeling Limited, the Wes Anderson film. Not his most popular film, but it's probably my favorite. And right in the middle of that movie, there's this this quick, sudden cut and then this smash cut to this long flashback before it goes back to the chronological story, which is fine. You can do that, but just know that that's going to be the thing that most people remember then about your book. So you don't have to maintain any specific shape, but the more that you kind of subvert shape expectations, just know that readers are going to remember the weird part, the weird subversion. All right, number 4, novels tend to work best with acute and chronic tensions, which means from scene to scene and across the whole overarching arc of the novel, you want to have a tension in the foreground, like in the front story. In the case of my book, there's this selling the house, but you also want to have a number of chronic tensions, something that you're trying to deal with in the past. So I'm trying to think of a good example. So for example, in the novel, The Great Gatsby, in the front story, in this sort of acute tension, Gatsby is trying to win back the love of Daisy. And that's also bound up in this past chronic tension of the fact that they were once in love with each other and they no longer are. So it can be really hard to have a novel that's entirely front story with no background, no history for these characters, no context. Likewise, if the entire story is told in summary or exposition and we don't know what the thing is in the foreground that we're reading for, the novel's going to feel so bogged down in the past that my suggestion would be just set it in the past as the present. So be thinking about that. Be thinking about your number 5. Remember plot. Tension needs to escalate. You don't want to start with the most climactic thing and then just let the air out of the novel. You can start with a really climactic moment and then let the air out, but then you have to keep building gradually back up. What is the final climax, the conflict that we're building toward? Number 6, character. All right, I've only put this one in quotes, which looks pretentious because this was a phrase I coined, and then I had a number of grad students who took my classes and then were teaching undergrads and using this, and it was getting misattributed. So I like this line, so I've kind of tagged it just so it comes back to me. I know that says more about me than I should be saying. But number 6 is, I like to say, don't worry too much about character when you write. Character will come. Character is what happens when plot meets point of view. Now, as a reader, my favorite thing about books is characterization, especially as a literary writer. Character is what really makes or breaks a book. But in the crafting of a book, I think writers can spend far too long worrying about who a character is before they've written their way into that character, which is to say, I tell my students, I would like to think that I'm the kind of human being that if I'm teaching and a tiger suddenly charges into the room, I would throw myself in front of the animal so the students could escape. But I don't know if I really am that person. I might throw a student in front of the tiger and run out myself and save my own skin. I don't know, because I've never in real life had a chance to kind of pass or fail that moral test, right? And I think the same has to be true of your characters in your novel. If you give them a plot and you give them a motivation and you give them a direction and then just let them go, then you can see whether they are, the character you want them to be or not. But put them to the test. If you write them already knowing what they're going to do, you're going to feel so sort of hamstrung by those expectations that it's going to be really difficult, I think, for you to write that character honestly and to allow yourself to follow that narrative thread of that character. Whereas if you leave yourself open to that character doing anything, you might find they surprise you. Which is to say that I don't plot out my novels. I have senses of where I want scenes to occur. I have senses of kind of like major beats that I want to take place, but I never know, what I'm going to do. I like to write toward that surprise, and that's what helps me keep the endings of my novel surprising and inevitable, I hope. So all that is to say that character is important, but when you're writing character, give them an arc, give them a plot, throw roadblocks in front of them, give them a motivation, which is to say a point of view, and then see what happens and let that become the character. I prefer that method of writing to, sitting down with a sheet and saying, like, my character's eyes are blue. My character hates spiders. My character would throw himself in front of the tiger. Don't do that. Just let the plot and the point of view reveal the character to you and to the reader as you go. And of course, you'll fix things in revision. Number 7, novels can navigate many tensions and subplots. You don't have to have one, but if you have too many, you do always run the risk of spreading yourself a little thin. Setting, number 8, is to me one of the most neglected things in fiction. Really, setting is what makes or breaks a novel, I think. I get sad when I read a book and I feel like it could have been set anywhere. I love knowing that a novel is set at a specific place at a specific time, and I love learning about that place and time. Number 9, remember that when juggling multiple points of view, you need to establish clear voices right away. You don't want to confuse the reader. I'm just going to skip. I've got a whole complicated John Fowles reference, but we're running out of time, so I'm just going to skip that. And then finally, number 10, I get the question a lot: how long is a novel? And there's no answer. Anything under 50,000 words is probably a little short, and anything over 150,000 words in the current market is probably a little long. But a novel can be any length, really. Mrs. Dalloway is 63,000 words. My first novel is 88,000 words. War and Peace was 587,000 words. All right, last thing, a few notes on revision. Number 1, all good writing is revision, absolutely. There's no writing without revision. I get very nervous when I'm talking to a young writer or a beginning writer who says they like to write, but they don't like to revise. And that's fine if that's where you are right now. Just know that in maturing in your writing and growing into your habit as a writer, you're really going to have to work at revision, because novels only succeed after many, many, many revisions. Same with short stories, same with essays, same with poems. Every word has to be interrogated. Every sentence at the sentence level has to be put through the ringer. And if you get bored easily, then it's going to be a struggle. Number 2, be prepared to file away a lot of work. I used to say be prepared to throw away a lot of work, but I don't believe you should throw anything away. You never know what you're going to find in those pages that don't become published. So for myself, I can honestly say with Lake Life, there was a point at which one of the drafts was over 600 pages. The book took place over 4 days. It now takes place over 3. The final draft was about 300 pages. So I threw away more pages and wrote more pages than the reader will ever read. But I don't regret that. I had to write those pages to figure out the characters, and I had to cut down those pages to get the sentences more elegant. So sometimes, in revising, as I say in number 4, sometimes things change very much from a first draft to a second draft. They can look really different. Plot lines change, characters change. Some are born, some disappear, verb tenses shift. My whole first draft of my novel was in past tense before I realized that it really belonged in present tense. Everything, as you revise, can be up for negotiation. Number 5, sometimes revision arrives through addition and sometimes through deletion. And sometimes revision just looks like an accordion going in and out. So I remember there was a point at which, my book expanded and then it shrank and then expanded even bigger and it shrank again. And that's just how you can figure out the book. Number 6, I really encourage writers to set a revision plan with manageable chunks in order to sidestep despair. If you're sitting there with a 625-page manuscript and you've got to get it down to a more reasonable 300 or 400 pages, you're just going to sit there and cry for a few days. But if you tell yourself, all right, I have 40 chapters and I'm going to give myself, a chapter a week to revise, and I'm just going to take, 9 or 10 months and do this, that sounds a lot more reasonable and a lot more manageable than I'm going to revise an entire novel. You just say, I'm going to revise a chapter a week, whatever that looks like. Number 7, don't feel compelled to revise chronologically. Meaning, if you're feeling really moved to work on a certain section of a story or a novel, work on that section. Because if you're feeling motivated, that's the chunk you should probably be working on. Just know that at some point, as you reach the end of the book, you will have to do a few revisions where you really do work from beginning to end several times for just a clarity of plot line, to make sure you have a good sense of pacing and a consistency of voice. If you never read the book from beginning to end, you're never going to get a sense of the novel's actual pacing. All right, and then finally, in closing, number 8, when you're sure you're done, I strongly encourage you to share your novel with at least 1 or 2 trusted readers before you send a book out. I think so many books might have been published if writers had taken some time and shown it around and gotten some objective feedback and given it one or two more drafts, and then maybe even put it in a drawer for a month and taken it back out and with fresh eyes, given it one more revision. Because often you'll be happy with a book, you'll send it to agents, nobody will bite, and you'll think the book is bad. And the book's not bad, it's just not finished. But unfortunately, now you can't send it back to those agents because they've already said no, thank you. If you take the time first to show it to a couple of readers you trust, then you can have a better sense of whether the book is succeeding or not. I like to show it to a reader who is also a writer, who can give me a sense of my craft and if the book is succeeding on a craft level. And then I also like to give the book to a reader who is just a reader, someone who enjoys reading. You know, we write so much in workshops and in class for other writers, we forget the fact that most readers aren't writers. You know, the majority of our readers should be people who just love to read good books. So it's always helpful to have someone who can just read a book for pleasure and who reads your work and says, yeah, I like this, or no, this is boring. And then you just work on the boring parts. So yeah, so in revision, remember, it's not just you. If you have the benefit of other eyes, it's always worth getting some insight before you start sending the book out for consideration on the market. All right, so that's like super fast, super condensed crash course on putting together first novels. Finally, in closing, just know, you know, I'm talking about Lake Life and I'm saying it's my debut novel. In reality, it's my third novel. Like most novelists, I have two other books in the drawer that I will never show anybody. One of them is embarrassing, and one of them is it's okay, but it's not even close to ready. And it would be easier for me to write a new novel than to go back and try to fix it. It's got so many flaws. So if you're just starting out writing and you're writing a novel and you're feeling down because you're like, I don't think this will ever be published, my advice is that's okay. Even if you're writing your first book as practice, it's going to teach you so many things about endurance. It's going to teach you so many things about just the art and the craft and the structure of novel writing. You don't have to write your first novel intending for it to be published. You can write a book to learn how to write a book, and that's going to make the next book even better. All right, so I'm going to unshare my screen now, and Adam's going to come in, and I think we're ready for Q&A.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jimmy. That was tremendous. I love it when a writer comes in and says a lot of the things I'm trying to communicate, but puts it even better. I feel like it makes my job so much easier. I really, I appreciate, and I love that. I mean, I love that sort of that blue collar approach to writing, right? Just like you're just like building a chair. You're just sitting there building a chair, and it just takes a lot of patience. And I feel like that point of view, that way of looking, alleviates a lot of the anxiety that writers, I mean, among other things, I think it alleviates a lot of anxiety writers feel about talent and this kind of stuff. So yes, thank you. That was wonderful.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah. And oh man, and we'll have to nerd out sometime about Virginia Woolf and John Fowles, because I mean,
oh sure.
love it. Yeah, I mean, it really made me want to read, because your book, I mean, as I said, I'm in the middle of your book, and it reminded me of Mrs. Dalloway, but more than that, it reminded me of The Lighthouse. I thought, it felt like there was a real strong, but anyway, great stuff. So let me ask a question. I'm just going to ask a few questions that I'm getting in the chat and that people sent in. And to everyone else, if you have any questions, just type them down here in the chat and we'll get to them when and if we can. So we'll just start actually with this question here, which was sort of similar to a question I was going to ask. Can you talk a little bit about the challenge from moving from short story writing to novel writing, sort of what that transition was for you and what you found difficult about it?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I would like to say that writing short stories for 15 years prepared me to write a novel, but the fact is it didn't. And I think that's okay, because I think more I think we really need to be talking more in workshop about the fact that these are different art forms. Short story isn't just training wheels for a novel. It's not like practice. They're totally different forms. And a short story isn't like a short novel any more than a poem is a short story. So I think they're their own forms. I think I had to unlearn story structure because in the early drafts of Lake Life, I was trying to make each chapter its own short story. And then I quickly realized that no, chapters are scenes, or they can be composed of many scenes, but they don't have to have, even though if they have an arc, they don't have to have like a perfect ending. They don't have to stand alone. There's maybe only one or two chapters in out of 40 in my novel that could stand alone as a short story. And even that would require some context. Once I realized like, okay, the entire thing is going to rely on understanding this backstory that's going to slowly get revealed over the first part of the novel, I can let go of thinking of this as a bunch of stories and just realize that no, like this is not an episodic novel. This is like a very tightly woven novel where everything depends on what's happened in another chapter. Kind of like I like to think of some novels as it's like a tower of pickup sticks. And I don't know if younger students will remember that game, but you would dump this pile of sticks, and then the goal was to remove one without having them all crash. And I think if you have a novel that's really tightly interwoven, each thread or chapter can be like that, where the novel wouldn't work or exist if you pulled any part of it out. So a lot of my revising the novel was just pulling out everything that felt like didn't have to be there. And that was the really painful part. Because with a short story, if you write a 30-page story and you cut 15 pages, it doesn't feel like a great loss. It feels like a loss of a week of work. Whereas with a novel, when you're pulling out hundreds of pages, that feels like years of work. So I think that the thing with short stories is what it did teach me is short stories taught me to write good prose. And one thing when I went to my novel, I wanted to write a novel that didn't make excuses for its length. Meaning, I see some story writers move to the novel form, and when they get longer, they let the sentences go a little. They don't worry about perfecting things at the sentence levels. They're okay with a baggier, I don't want to say lazier, but less careful prose. And I wanted to write a novel that felt as tight at the sentence level as stories. But doing that takes a while because it's just a lot of pages.
Yeah. Actually, can you that ties into another question someone sent in, just about sort of just the endurance of writing a novel and how you manage to keep going. I mean, just the endurance of writing a short story, I find, and revising a short story, I find very difficult. And with a novel, it's a whole other thing. I'd just be curious about sort of it's so much an emotional game in a lot of ways of just sort of keeping holding yourself together and keeping on it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
I think some of the best advice that I got early on. I didn't go to Iowa. I didn't come out of the famous Iowa MFA program, but I learned a lot from a writer I love named Brett Anthony Johnson, and he was a student of Frank Conroy at Iowa, and he had this thing where he would tell his students, you know, the majority of writing is just ass in chair time, and so I think when it comes to that endurance for getting through a story or a novel, for me, it was about making a schedule for myself and not waiting for the muse to meet me, but going to meet the muse, like sitting down at my computer at the same time every day. When I was in grad school, I wrote at night. When I became a father, I wrote during the day when my kids were at school. Now that we're in a pandemic, I can't really give any good advice because like everything is crazy right now. And my own writing habits that have served me well for 15 years have gone out the window. Life is insane. And I think right now you just have to take care of yourself and your mental health seriously. I'm not just saying that first and foremost, but hopefully assuming things return to something closer to normal in the next year or two, it's really helpful to get into a writing habit. There's no magic time of day. It's just whatever works for you. But if you can try to write for at least a few hours a day, most days of the week, you will, I've found, get into a rhythm that is really hard to access if you're a binge writer or if you're taking too many times off between writing sessions.
Question here I thought was interesting. Is there anything you wouldn't write? Do you have any boundaries placed on yourself when it comes to writing?
Ooh, that's tough. You know, I tend to stick to literary fiction. I read a lot of sci-fi. I read a lot of comic books. I've never tried really writing. I have some fabulous stuff. I have some magic realist stuff, but I haven't gone too far off in that direction. I don't think I would write historical fiction because, as I've learned, I'm very bad at research. Um, which is to say that I get so bogged down in research, I can put off writing for a very long time because I just wind up getting fascinated by something. In one of the characters in my novel, his name is Richard, and he's a physicist and he's a genius. And I am neither a physicist nor am I a genius. So I read so many books on math and physics that I did not understand, trying to get into this guy's head. And the early draft of this book was just this guy who spoke in all these equations. And finally, a smart reader said to me, this guy's more interesting when he's just drinking beer with his son and throwing horseshoes on the lawn. Even geniuses like horseshoes too. And I was like, oh yeah, like I don't have to write this caricatured math professor. So I think I'd have a really difficult time, writing a Victorian era novel or a novel about Henry VIII, which is like my wife's favorite kind of novel, just because trying to approximate those ways of speaking, those bodies of knowledge, those time periods, I think my writing would come across as so stilted and so forced that I feel most comfortable just like writing books about characters who own cell phones.
Right. Yeah. So sort of a related question, I think, here is from, let's see, what it says. Thank you for having this talk. I'm a horror writer, and during revision, I'm sometimes surprised at how vicious some of my chapters are, violent, sinister, gory. Do you ever revise with your intended audience in mind, or would you suggest writing what you want regardless of whether it will ever sit on the bookshelf? I mean, I think sort of the vital part of that question is you write something that's just too disturbing, perhaps, or yeah, too disturbing for the reader, and decide to revise it based on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there's a market for everything. I don't read a lot of horror. I don't like scary movies, and I certainly, I would never go and see like those Saw movies, those sort of torture movies. I can't handle that stuff. But then, I say that, and those movies have made more than I will make in a lifetime. So, aesthetically, I wouldn't say that anything has to be judged necessarily. It just depends on what you want to do. I would say that if you're into like really gritty, really gruesome, violent kinds of horror, then my best piece of advice would be read that stuff, figure out what the limits are for the masters of the practitioners of that field. I don't know a lot about that field, but I would say, look to the Chuck Palahniuks and the other writers in those areas, see how far they go. And I'm sure some of them, if you give it a Google, will have essays out there on what their limits are. And then you can kind of decide like, okay, if these are the masters and they're saying these are the limits, where am I kind of like pushing up against those limits or maybe going too far?
I've got a another, I think, great craft question here. With so many central characters in your novel, there must be several conflicts at play. So how do you approach including several conflicts in a singular work? Sort of what do you see as holding the whole book together with all the various conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what holds the book together is the web of this family. So there's 6 characters, and then there's 3 marriages. Or 3 relationships. There's the parents are married, and then there's one son and his wife, and one son and his partner. And at some point, I realized I was writing a book about 3 relationships, and it's kind of a portrait of, well, it's a portrait of life in 2018. It's a portrait of kind of life in the beginning of the first Trump administration. It's a portrait of class and socioeconomics in the American South, but it's also very much about love and sexuality in the 21st century. And so one of these marriages is tested by infidelity. One of these marriages is tested by an unplanned pregnancy. And one of these, the relationship is tested by the fact that one of these men would like to be in an open relationship and one would like to be in a monogamous relationship. And so once I realized that kind of this whole book I was writing was about love and family and sexuality, I could, even though there's lots of subplots and tensions, there's alcoholism, there's death, there's career issues, there's all sorts of conflicts going on. But the main one that follows through is to see kind of which of the three of these relationships is going to stay together. And I think that's more than the question of will the house sell or not. Like that's just kind of the like, oh yeah, like that's, you know, the red herring of the book. Like by the end of the novel, I would hope that nobody really gives a damn about whether the house is sold. I want people to care about which of these three relationships makes it. And at the end, even if they make it to the end of the book, which of these would the reader think might make it in the long run? Because I think that to me is that's the one reason I like to go to book clubs and things, is to hear people talk about and argue about the ending and say which of these three relationships makes it in the long run after this book is over. You know, because I think every reader is going to bring different history and their own experiences to the book and have different opinions about whether or not this is a happy ending.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about the nature of conflict. I often find that initially I might have a number of conflicts, but if I can find a central conflict to sort of hang the others off of, then everything sort of falls into place. That one sort of conflict or that one way of seeing it kind of gives it the shape that the other things kind of radiate out from or hang off of. So that rang true to me. Do you, maybe we should just have this one last question because we're getting out of time, but I think this is an interesting one, something I haven't thought about much. Do you think the pandemic is going to seriously change the type of novels about today's time due to social isolation, since people are not living like they were a year ago? What kind of impact do you think COVID will have on the way novels work in terms of character interaction or really anything else?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think it's too soon to tell. I think it depends how long it goes on for. I think it depends on whether we do have vaccines and whether they work and how well. I'm only saying, I'm only reluctant to say because I remember after, I'm sure you remember as well, after 9/11, we were all sure that 9/11 was going to define all novels for the next 100 years. And I read a lot of articles from a lot of smart writers in a lot of great places about the future of the American novel in a post 9/11 world. But honestly, by 2005, 2006, novels just returned to the same kind of novels that I remember seeing in the 90s. So I think the lasting effects will depend on what the lasting effects of the pandemic are. I do think, though, that, you know, I can only speak for myself, but I've been working on this novel now in isolation, and it's not set in the pandemic. It's set before the pandemic. But just the fact that I'm writing at night again instead of writing during the day, and the fact that I'm writing, and I haven't seen anyone outside of my wife and kids for months, it is becoming, in this weird way, a novel about isolation and loneliness. And that's not what it started out as, but I think it's because it's so infused with my mood for the past 7 months.
Right. Well, thank you so much. This has been so great and so illuminating. I really appreciate you sticking around to answer these questions. Just terrific. And I don't know if we can give you, I don't know how rounds of applause work here, but you imagine the crowd's roaring. Yeah, there we go. See those little yellow hands. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for coming. We have Patricia Smith, November 10th. All right. Take care, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And yeah, and I look forward to, is it your class I'm speaking in later?
Yeah, you're going to be speaking to my class. So they're in luck, but it's a much smaller group. But yeah, absolutely. The rest of you will have to, I don't know, catch Jamie another time.
Well, thank you.
All right.
Thanks for coming out. Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye.